Hi, my name is Curtis Poe, and I want to talk to you today about bringing modern object-oriented programming into the Perl core. First of all, I want to thank all of you for joining us at FOSDEM 2021. It's been a fascinating year that we've had to go through with the pandemic and everything, and attending a virtual conference with me presenting remotely and I can't actually interact with my audience directly is an interesting challenge, but I hope you'll bear with me as I try to deal with how things are going. You'll notice when I talk about bringing OO to the Perl core that I've spelled this COR. That's because of something that I'll explain in just a moment, but I want you to know that's not actually a typo. As for myself, I'm Curtis Poe, but online is Ovid to many folks. I'm with allaroundtheworld.fr. We're a consulting firm, and we specialize in building complex software for people and building bespoke teams that fit what the company actually needs, as opposed to we have 3 people on hand who might or might not be able to do what you want, and we'll just toss them at you. You can follow me at Twitter on Ovid or you can just email me at ovid@allaroundtheworld.fr. You can also check out taostation.space, which is the narrative MMORPG that we've been building. Absolutely fantastic. It's a lot of fun to play. It's for people who like reading rather than just the beautiful graphics. But if you're blind or if you have limited mobility, you'll discover that it's very easy to play, very easy to follow along in a way that a few other games are, because we think that's important. The morality of that is important, being accessible to everyone. But enough of that. I want to talk about core. And when I first came up with the idea of bringing modern object-oriented programming to the Perl core, this wasn't initially me. Stephen Little had been doing a lot of work on this before that. He's the one who wrote Moose, for example. But he wanted to do something even better and have truly modern object-oriented programming available. But he'd been working on it for a long time by himself, and I think he kind of got burnt out, to be honest. So I picked up the baton, and I was trying to figure out what's the smallest thing that I could put together that the Perl 5 porters, P5P, might accept. And the Sawyer, the pumpkin for Perl 5 porters, came to me and said, don't think about that. Don't worry about the implementation. Build excellence. And then later, when I found out about the Perl 7 project, I realized I was thinking too small. I was thinking within the confines of what Perl currently does, and I wasn't thinking about what it could do. So core now is my attempt to keep something which is like Perl, but a little bit more. Terminology, be aware that when I talk about slots, I'm talking about basically the places where the data for an object is stored. Currently in Perl, we tend to use something called a blessed hash reference. So the key value pairs would be the slots where we store the data. So that's what I'm talking about there. Attributes is a heavily overloaded term in many programming languages, including Perl. In this case, attributes are simply slot modifiers such as reader, writer. They give some additional behavior to the slot, which we'll understand more later. And the term core itself is basically short for Karina. The poet Ovid wrote a lot of love letters to a woman named Karina, love poems, to a woman named Karina. So I just shortened that to core. But then that hits the problem of we talk about bringing core to the core, and people are like, I don't understand. So if you want to just call core Karina, don't worry about the name because the name is going away. It just gave me a handle that I can refer to the project by. But Ovid was Italian, so let's talk about something Italian. Pizza. Pizza's wonderful. I live close to the Italian border. Pizza in Italy is amazing, and you want to open up a pizza joint in a town, but they already have a pizza joint. How are you going to beat them? You might think about offering a better pizza. You might think about offering a cheaper pizza, but it turns out the cheaper pizza is a disaster because people associate cheap with poor quality. Economists have known this for a long time. Business experts have known this for a long time. When I sold cars, one of the things they hammered into our heads over and over again is the customers who are happiest with the cars are those who have paid the most money because they're the ones who get sold in the value. And it was true. My happiest customers paid the most for their cars. So you don't want to look at cheap. You don't want to look at price for the pizza you're offering. You're looking at value, because value is what attracts people. And when we talk about Perl, and we want to talk about the difference between price and value, what's the price of Perl? It's It's got a shallow learning curve for the basics. It's got a steep learning curve when you want to get advanced. So that's something to consider. But no one actually cares. Rust has a steep learning curve. People love Rust. C++ has a steep learning curve. I don't think anyone loves C++, but they can get a job with that very easily. There's lots of languages where you have a very steep price for learning the language, but people appreciate it. Why? Because they get great value. And what's the value of Perl? It's not available jobs anymore. Back when I learned Perl, I could have quit my job every 6 months and gotten a pay rise. Well, I kind of did, because there were jobs everywhere. In the past 15, 20 years, those jobs have dropped tremendously. There's still a lot of them, but not nearly as many as there were. Data science and AI are kind of taking over the software world. Perl doesn't have much to offer there, which is kind of an embarrassment. So that's not the value we're looking for. The CPAN testers, Unicode support, regular expressions, those are great, but those are marginal value for many people. We're not worried about that. Everybody hits OO, either because they want to develop OO software or they have to maintain OO software. OO is an almost universal value for a given programming language. So if you have powerful OO, you offer something which is of tremendous value. So let's not forget about that. So, as a new developer, how do I write object-oriented code in Perl? Well, that's simple. They ask this question, and you tell them, use a CPAN client. What? Okay, use a CPAN client. What does that mean? Well, now I have to learn how to download this extension. That's actually not bad. We're getting more and more used to downloading extensions, even for something that probably should be core to the language, but okay, we'll let that slide. Then they got to pick an OO system. And wait, what do you mean I've got to pick an OO system? No, just pick one of them. And no one has any idea what the heck they're going to pick if they're new to the language. They can't, because they won't have the background. And then finally they pick one and you say, no, not that one. Okay, fine. And then the build fails after 15 minutes because they picked a particular one and they get this obscure error message. Oh, just force the install, don't worry about it. That's an embarrassment. That is a horrible embarrassment for the language. People shouldn't have to go through that. If they want to install a different object-oriented system to replace the core one, that's absolutely fine. They should be expert enough in the language in order to be able to make that decision, to understand what that means, but not when they're new to the language. Instead, they want to learn how to do OO and Perl, and now they have to learn how to pick which OO system they want to install. Then they have to learn how to install a CPAN client and how to use that to install that OO system. And what happens if they get test failures and there's too many OO systems to pick from? And no, this is bad. And I am tired as a consultant going into clients and, oh, you've written another in-house OO system because what you find in the market is not suitable for you because we don't have something in core. Or they built something long before Moose and now they have settled on that over the years, and I can understand why, but it's frustrating. And Bless is not the value that you were looking for. There's nothing wrong with Bless. If you want to use Bless, that's fine. Not for a brand new developer, because you've got to wire everything together, which means you're going to be creating your own unique set of bugs. We don't need that. OO. So core OO is assembly language for object-oriented programming. We don't need that. Moose and the family of languages changed everything and was great. It gave people an appreciation for better object-oriented programming. But it's not in the core, so it raises the question of what should be. Good enough is not good enough. Most object-oriented systems are incomplete. They're sugar forgetters and setters, and they often offer you a default constructor. And we need to stop treating objects like structs, but that's what we do. It's like, oh, look, it's a data structure with methods you can call on it. That's not what an object is. An object is an expert about the system that it works on, which might be a data structure with methods you can attach to it, but generally shouldn't be. But I'm not going to go into object-oriented design in this talk because we're going to get distracted. Instead of thinking about something that's just good enough, that'll kind of work, we need to be better than. That's very important. We need to be better than what we had. We need to be better than other languages. We need to reach for that gold medal rather than settling for the bare basics or settling for this mess. I am so tired of this. This happens to me all the time. I go into clients and I'm trying to debug performance problems and I'm running my NYT prof and boom, everything coming out of Moose, it slows everything down when it doesn't have to be because it's, well, Moose is third party. It's not core to the language. Good enough is not good enough. We need to stop that. Core wants to add modern OO to the Perl core, making OO easy. But we have the opportunity to build something beautiful, wonderful, more powerful than most languages, but still feel like Perl if we do it right. So I've got a grammar for it. Here's another grammar for just the methods. The grammar's mostly done. The initial semantics are mostly done. But it's complicated. There's a lot of little corner cases that we have to deal with. So we've got to figure out exactly what we're going to be putting in the MVP to pitch that to P5P to see if they'll accept it. But I want to talk about the design considerations so you know where I'm coming from because I'm the driver behind this. My first and foremost was easy things should be easy and hard things should be possible, which is, that's Perl in a nutshell. That has been Perl for decades. So keep that in mind. I want small systems to be easy to build. It should be trivial to just prototype stuff. But large systems should have a greater safety. I work with many companies who have 500,000 to 1 million plus lines of Perl code. And large systems where you don't offer some sort of safety about the kinds of data that you're working with, they're difficult to work with. They're frustrating to work with. And I have to work with these clients to manage things. So I really want Core to be able to offer them something built in to handle that. Tremendously need to decouple data and accessors and constructors. You'll see a little bit more about that as we go along. We need to encourage smaller interfaces, but there we're talking a little bit more about fundamentals of object-oriented design that I also won't be going into in this talk. But we need to cater to new developers. And you might ask what I mean by a new developer. Do I mean new to Perl or new to programming? I mean both. We want it to be simple. I mean, this is from Moo. Has name is RWP. What's RWP? That's read-write protected. Okay, fine. What is read-write protected? In Moose, it's has name, and it's got a reader. Once you understand it, it's actually pretty easy to follow. It's not complicated. It's not difficult. We want this to be accessible to people who come along. So I've avoided things like :RWP because I want it to be easy to read. I want it to be accessible to newbies. Paul Graham created ARC to be catered to experts. ARC is dead. You go out to the boards for ARC on development and how to learn ARC, no one's posting them anymore. No one cares because he made a language that was not accessible to the mass of programmers. So Core is very opinionated. Fair warning, this is mostly my opinions, but it is very Perlish. It still feels like Perl, even though we had to extend the language a little bit for this. And it's very practical because it's very easy to write with Core, and you'll see more examples of that later. If you want to contribute to this, be aware you can go to ircperl.org, #core, or github.com/core. Sorry, the video is covering up that URL. There's a lot of work which is being involved. A lot of different people are being contacted discussing this. But let's get closer into this. I want you to know that all Core syntax that you're about to see is speculative. It's mostly nailed down. What you're seeing is probably the final version. There are some little bits that we're arguing about here and there because we're not sure, but it's pretty close to it. But the data types are for entertainment purposes only. Do not pay attention to them. I put them in there so you can see what the potential future is, but there's problems because data types aren't just for Core. They're also for a regular bit of Perl code, not object-oriented, just being able to type a variable, or how data types are going to be used in signatures, which Dave Mitchell's been working on. So because types are going to be used in so many areas, and we need to unify how types are used across all those different areas, I pulled types out of the original Core specification because it wasn't appropriate to be there. But let's talk about the evolution of what we've got right now. Specifically, I don't want to talk about blessing and reference. Most of the old timers are familiar with that. Newer developers are less familiar with that. So we'll go ahead and start with this. Moose was first released back in 2006, And you can see right here that we had to import strict warnings. Is a int, well, that's code which is being invoked right there. But that's mostly what we understand for Moose today. It's very similar to that. Here's a point object in the original version of Moose, and that's going to be important because I'm going to be using this as for later examples so you can see the power of what we're talking about here. Here's Moxie. Stephen Little was a creator of Moose, and he realized there's a lot of limitations of Moose, and he was trying to create something better, core, that we could put into the language. Simple and easy, and this is part of what he created with Moxie. And you can see that we're declaring our slots here. We have default values for those slots. We're declaring the accessors for the slots. I won't go into details about the syntax. Here's how you clear those values. This was ugly because it made the assumption of a blessed hash reference, which I think was unfortunate in this case. Core does this. The reason I think this is better is because it's so much simpler. It's easy. We don't have to worry about how it's implemented under the hood. We're not introducing a lot of complex syntax. We're just declaring our slot variables. We say that we can pass it to the constructor. We have readers for both of those, and we can clear them. It's that simple. There's nothing complex about that. So here's Moxie on the left. Here's Core on the right. Exact same thing, just different, cleaner syntax. So Moose was great, but it had some really bad affordances, and a lot of that wasn't Stephen Little's fault. It's limitations of the Perl programming language itself, which he had to work around. So Moose winds up being clumsy for many of the things that we needed. Raku, however, has some great ideas. So I've stolen a lot from Raku, but I needed to have this fit with how Perl worked, because they are different languages. For those of you who are not familiar, Raku used to be called Perl 6, and a lot of people thought it was going to be the successor for Perl, but it's not. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about stealing some ideas from Raku. So when we talk about Moose, when we declare a slot, we use the has function. And has handles slot declaration, attributes, types, coercion, delegation, clears, predicates, blah, 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 blah. If you want to talk about a hideously overloaded function, this is it. This is exactly the problem we're talking about. It's trying to do too many things, and it gets confusing at times. Core, what does has do for core? Just a slot declaration, that's it. Nothing else. Very simple, very predictable. So let's look at what this actually means. We'll take a simple object, a customer object. It has slots, name, birth date, optional title, doctor, Ms., whatever. And it's got customer methods like full name, or predicate methods, are you old enough to vote, drive, etc. It looked like this in Moose. And you can see here are the slots. Pretty straightforward, title, name, birth date. Here are the various methods that we have. The difference is slots are just dumb pieces of data. You call them, you get your data back. The methods actually do stuff, to keep that simple. Note the slots are all immutable. So RO means read only. What does that actually mean, though? Why is that important? Well, think about this. We have our predicate method, old enough to vote. If Ovid old enough to vote, blah, blah, blah. Then we set the birth date to yesterday. Except old enough to vote isn't yesterday, obviously, which means I can have a guard to verify that it is okay to follow this path of code, and then I can set my object to an invalid state, and I can no longer guarantee the correctness of my program. So I throw an exception if I try and modify that. That's why we like one of the reasons we like read-only objects. But because the datetime object in that slot is not read-only, I can grab out my birth date, and then I can set the year to last year, and now I violated my old enough to vote constraint. So it's still a problem. In fact, this is not a theoretical problem. This is a real-world problem. Ricardo Sinius wrote a great blog article about how this was hurting them on their project. And as a result of that, we had datetime moonpig and datetime x immutable. Some of my clients, what I do when we're using the DBX class ORM, I make sure that when we pull dates out of the database and it gets inflated to a datetime object, I make sure it's inflated to this immutable date type object, so they don't have to worry about that because immutability is important. If I'm passing an object to another function, the object is a reference to data, and that other function modifies that data. I don't necessarily know. So now I've got two different sections of code working on two different sections of data that it thinks are the same, and I can't guarantee correctness. Immutability is what you want. So, of course, as immutability should be the default. But that means default. It's not a guarantee. Sometimes you want mutability. So it's trivial to make it mutable just by adding the writer attribute to the slot. So that's fine. We're not dogmatic, but we do push you in the right direction. But we've got a new business rule. Never refer to customers by their name. Never do that. Refer to them by title plus name if they have a title. Because, Dr. Smith might not want to be referred to as Smith or Brian or whatever. So what we do in our code, we've got this full name method that you can see up there. And the full name method is the title. And if we have a title, then we include the title, or we just have an empty string, and then we concatenate the title to the name. Later, we refer to them by their full name. But, someone's going to call the name method. That might violate our new business rule, and we don't want that to happen. So what do? We actually want the name method to be private. We don't want people to be able to call that method. But we don't want to pass underscore name to new. So what do? We have an init arg of name. It's called underscore name, so it doesn't have a public method, but the init arg is name, which says when you pass it to the constructor, you can use name instead of underscore name. And if you call customer name, you get a method not found exception. Except someone's going to call the underscore name sooner or later. Yes, they will. I see this in code all the time. It's very frustrating. You don't actually want to expose that data. So what do we have? We can say name is bare. Bare means we don't have a getter or a setter for this particular attribute. There's nothing we can do with it aside from passing the constructor. If we need to get the value out of it, though, how do we do that? Because the full name method needs to know what the name was set to. Well, my name equals self meta, get attribute name, get value, self. No one does that. No one does that. They don't bother. They just make name public or something like that and hope that people don't abuse it. So init arg bare, those are some clever solutions for this problem that we have, but they're clumsy solutions. We want to avoid those. And the has function in Moose and Moo, it conflates so many different responsibilities, and we want to eliminate that. And that's part of what core is trying to do. So, by default, when you're building an object system, don't expose any of your public data. Don't expose any of your data. Just don't do that. If you have a case where you have to expose it, do that on a case-by-case basis, not rather than just blankly splatting everything out there. But it's painful to do with Moose. In core, it's easy. So in core, we believe that private data should be easy, and we don't encourage promiscuous data. That's a very important design principle behind this. So here's how we do this in core. Notice our class customer, we have a name, title, birth date. None of these have a reader. You can't read those from outside the code because there's no need to do that. But we do have a name method, and we just return the title. And if there's a title, title plus name, otherwise just a name. We have our predicate methods because we don't need to expose the data. Please keep that in mind, it's important. Attributes. So attributes, I hate the term because it's so terribly overloaded. Attributes in Moose are often the name that people use for the slot data. But sometimes they can be very expensive to calculate this data. But what if they only need to be calculated once? So, for example, the 3000th Fibonacci number only needs to be calculated once. And then that's fine. But we have other things like, let's take an example of volume. We have a box object with height, width, and depth. Volume here is height times width times depth. That's not actually expensive to calculate, but for the sake of argument, we're going to say that it is, just to show you how Moose would handle something like this. If you call this method volume, it'll be recalculated every time. But if it's in a Moose attribute, it's calculated once and only once. So how does that actually work? Well, we do this. Has volume. First, we make it read-only because you don't want someone to be able to set the volume to a different value. We assert that it's a number. Int arg is on def because you don't want someone to pass the volume into this box object because that'd be silly. Lazy because we don't want it to be calculated if we never call the volume method because that would be expensive and a waste of CPU side. And then we have a builder, build volume, which is the height plus times the width times the depth, which you can't see because my video is cutting it off. That's a lot of junk for nothing. People don't do that. They just declare a volume method and they're going to recalculate it every time because you don't want to jump through all those hoops and try to remember all that stuff because the more stuff you have to remember, the more likely you're going to have bugs. Why do you want to do that? Core. How do you do this in core? That's it. Reader, so you can read the volume. Because it doesn't have a new attribute, you can't pass it in the constructor. Now we have a builder, which multiplies the height times the width times the depth. Once and only once, and that's it. It is that simple to create this in core. So here's Moose. Here's core. Which do you want to write? Yeah, I thought so. That's the great thing, I suppose, about having these pre-recorded videos, because you can't argue with me. Well, let's talk about object construction. That's another thing that's sometimes kind of complicated, and Moose has all sorts of little corner cases, and we're going to deal with this right now. There's a lot of stuff we're also going to skip, because object construction can be complicated sometimes. So here we have height, width, and depth of our box object. We have new, saying we have to pass those to the constructor. Great. Here we have a name, but undef, which means we can pass it to the constructor, but because it has a default, it's not required. Here we have a volume, which has a builder and a reader, which means you can read the build, you read the volume method. The builder means we have a way of building this, and because it doesn't have a new, it means we cannot pass it to the constructor. That's simple. All of our construction rules about what we can and cannot pass are just dependent upon the existence of the new attribute or non-existence of the new attribute and whether or not it has a default value. So here, this is Moose. We have height, width, and depth. Height, width, and depth. Okay, and then we say box volume, fine, 21. But what if we want to do this? What if we want to say box new 7? What would that mean? That would be a cube where everything is 7 units on each side and the volume is 343 cubic units. How would we set up the constructor to allow a single value like that? Well, in Moose, you've got BUILDARGS, which you've got a round BUILDARGS, sub, orig class. That's 1 equals args. My num equals args 0. And then I've got this height width class orig. That's strange. Okay, but once you learn the incantation, it works. Okay, fine. And then you can call box new with a single argument. But we know in Moose you can pass a list of key value pairs, or you can pass a single hash ref, which is going to cause you all sorts of problems because you were expecting a single argument, and here you got 1, but this argument's not an integer. We'll lead through most of that. But basically what it means is in BUILDARGS we have if 1 equals args and not ref args 0. And that's actually not enough, but I'm not going to go into detail because it starts to get complicated, ugly, and embarrassing. For my clients, I just tend to do this. If I have to create a BUILDARGS, my args equals 1 equals args, then args dereference or args. It's just this voodoo line noise that is an embarrassment that I never, ever want to have to write again. But I write it all the time, and it mostly works. Here's how they do it in Java. They have constructor overloading, where you can have different types of constructors. This one has 3 arguments. This one has 1. It's that simple. And you call box new with 3 arguments or 1 argument, and it just all magically works. Part of that's because new is a keyword in Java, not just a method. And in Moose, you've got this embarrassing set of code versus something that's actually kind of clean, easier to read in Java. Why is Java easier to read than Perl? That should not be the case. Why is Java less verbose than Perl? That should not be the case. The downside of this, though, is we've got this in Java. Which of those three arguments is the height, width, or depth? You don't know. In core, we make this simple. We simply have a construct method. It takes the arguments. If args equals 1, if we only have a single argument, then we map those arguments to height, width, and depth, and we return the args. There's nothing fancy. There's nothing complicated. We don't pass in a hash ref or an optional list of key value pairs or whatever. It's simple. It's easy. So here's Moose, this weird voodoo for BUILDARGS, and here's core. It's much simpler, much easier to follow. Or you could just use next to constructor if you want to skip all of that. You can say new box takes a single argument and then I call new. And it makes life much, much easier for you. So core makes object construction easy, something which other systems often do not. But let's look at classic OO. We're going to start doing some comparisons here. Here's classic OO for a customer object, and then here's what it looks like for Moose. You can see Moose is a lot simpler. Moose is declarative, as opposed to this procedural code that we have for core Perl. And then we have core versus Moose. Here's how simple and easy core is compared to Moose, because core is extending the syntax of the language just a little bit. And then look at core Perl versus core Karina. There's no question which I would rather write, because the core Perl, it's very easy to get that wrong. Very easy to get that wrong. In Karina, it's much harder to get that wrong, and it's much easier to read this than this. So, object systems out there for Perl currently, many of them are they're public methods for data, but they expose way too much. And Moose and Moo practically require public methods. It's hard to kind of avoid those. And everybody wants public methods. We make it easier in core. You just slap on a reader or writer attribute, but we don't default to that. So attributes for data should just be easy, and we make them easy for core. But let's look at a bit of real-world code, something a little bit more sophisticated than just a dummy customer object. In this case, this is a least recently used cache, cache LRU, where basically anything which hasn't been used recently gets pushed out of the cache, and we have a certain minimum number of objects. And it's kind of hard to read this core Perl OO code for that. We can list Moose, and it becomes a little bit easier. We can rewrite it in core, and it becomes dead simple. We have our cache, which is a hash-ordered object. We have a created, which is the time it was created, the max size. We can instantly see just all the data that we need for this. And then we only have get is handled by the cache, but set, this handles evicting something from the cache if it is not new. And it's very simple and easy. It makes it easier to see the code that we're working with. It makes it easier to read the code that we're working with. Much easier to write correct code because we've simplified object construction tremendously. Here, we see we have non-lazy defaults. We create our reader, which is set to the current time of when we've instantiated this particular object. We have the cache, where it's hash ordered. We just read and write from this particular cache variable directly. There's no reason to go through a method call for that. We have the max size. Here we have new, which means even though it has a default of 20, we can set that to a different value if we wanted to. And we have a reader, so we can read what the max size is if we get a cache object. And here we just access it directly. It's very simple. It's very easy. And here's how I wrote it in Raku, because just for those who are curious about this, you can see how this is conceptually very, very similar to Raku. I borrowed a lot of ideas from Raku, but I wanted it to be easier. Except turns out Raku didn't exist, or doesn't actually work because the ordered hash was sorted and not ordered. A subtle difference which caused a problem there. But let's think about the has function, which is the key thing which most people are going to be focusing with core. Has, like mine, it declares a variable, which is bound to the lexical scope that it's declared in. And we have attributes we can apply to it. We've got a new attribute saying you can pass it in the constructor. Here the new attribute has a default, so you can pass it to the constructor, but now it's optional. got a builder to build the value if it's not present. We've got readers, so you can make it easy to read the data if you need to. Writer, if you want to make it mutable. It's all there. It's all available for you. We've got quite a number of attributes, in fact, to give you a lot of control over how you're going to manage this behavior. And I think that's extremely important. There's one illegal combination currently, which is a builder and the equals default, because equals default is kind of a synonym for the builder. It's just when you have a simple scalar value or that you want to assign to it as opposed to something you have to actually compute. Or duplicating any attribute is you don't want to have :new listed twice or :builder listed twice, because that wouldn't make any sense. And the goal behind this is to make attributes as composable as possible, to make it difficult for you as a developer to write something that's invalid. I think that's extremely important. And were it not for the equals default, every single attribute attached to a slot would be composable. So you wouldn't have to worry about, does this work with this? Does this work with that? What does that mean? It's all simple and easy. But another guiding principle is that core should support types. I can't get that in the first version. As much as I wanted to, it simply wasn't going to work, and that's unfortunate. I'm sorry, but you need to be aware that we couldn't do that yet. There's a lot of debate about how types would actually be structured, how we would declare them in the language. Do you declare it first? Do you declare it afterwards? What's the exact syntax? So we had to punt on that because there's so many other areas of language that this impacts. So Paul Evans, he wrote ObjectPad. ObjectPad is great. It's been a great test bed for a lot of the things that we're doing, and I really appreciate the fact that he hasn't done work with optimizing it. So even though object construction is a little bit slower, the runtime using the objects is actually faster than with Core Perl or with Moose or Blue, obviously, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I'm just delighted by that. It probably will first be released under a feature guard, say use feature class or something like that, so that we don't have to worry about it causing problems with older versions of Perl. We're familiar with how feature guards work. The steering committee might veto this. That'll possibly depend upon how P5P feels about the initial implementation work. And we're trying to do small steps at first. We're still trying to get a minimum viable product, but we want this minimum viable product to be far superior to what you can get in most object-oriented programming systems today. That's very important to us. So you can go out to CPAD right now, check out ObjectPad, and get a feel for how a lot of that works, start playing around with that. Give feedback to Paul. He's really going to appreciate it because that will help us better understand what is actually being done here. But there are some objections to core, and I need to address those so people are aware of them up front. Some people say bless is good enough for me. Okay, fine. We're not proposing removing bless from the core. If you want to use bless, do it. That's simple. Why not moose or moo in the core? Moose pulls in a huge ton of dependencies, far more than the profile porters want to maintain, because it adds an extra burden, a huge extra burden of a lot of work on them, and they don't want to do that. So maybe just moo, because moo's pretty simple. Moo's got a lot of the wrong affordances like moose, but it's faster, it's simpler. But moo has meta. And the meta method, if you call make immutable, that's a no-op. But if you call anything else on meta, Moo says, oh, they actually wanted moose, and it will inflate a meta class. It will inflate your object to a proper moose class, which means if we include moo, we have two choices. Either A, we include moose and all the dependencies, which P5P doesn't want, or we say the new version of moo, the meta doesn't work the same way, therefore it's no longer backwards compatible, and we potentially break the code of everyone already using moo. Maybe, we're not sure. But I think more it's the bad affordances, like with has, which is the biggest issue that we have to worry about, plus the fact that we can't distinguish between subs and methods appropriately. There's a lot of other subtle things in there, but basically we have the opportunity to build something better. Let us take that, because good enough is not good enough. So some people say just make it a module. Fine. We're back to the same problem we have now. Pick one. Which one of those do you want? And XKCD really sums it up when they talk about, there's 14 competing standards. Well, we're going to create a new one which encompasses all of the use cases, and now we have 15 competing standards. No. Perl 7 discussion pushed a lot of this, and I know this is controversial for many people, and I'm not going to get into all the background about this, but I'm going to show you what I had originally thought. Perl 7, we were going to release core under the feature guard, and then under Perl 8, we were going to remove the feature guard. It was going to be permanently part of the language. But why stop there? Because it turns out there's so much more we can do once we start thinking about the future possibilities of the programming language. For example, we have module, some module. Within that lexical scope, we can introduce backwards incompatible syntax changes that we never could before. We can make strict warnings required there, or just automatic there. We can have typed signatures. We can have multi-methods. We can have typed signatures and multi-methods in those things. We can have typed variables inside of the language. We don't know what the syntax is going to look like yet. But before we think about that, we need to think about how to get core into core. In order to do that, we need to figure out what's the minimum feature set that gives us something magnificent, gives us something better than what's currently available out there. And because that minimum feature set actually turns out to be so easy to learn, we're going to offer standard OO, which is far more terse but far more expressive than most other OO languages out there. And this is going to give Perl a magnificent opportunity to excel, one that I don't think we should pass on. And as I mentioned, we're probably going to start that with use feature class for the feature guard. And there's been a lot of interesting ideas about it. We need to be careful to get it right. Core v2, there's a moderate amount of discussion about what's going to be involved there. I don't want to get into that now because some of those features could be in Core v2. Some of those might just be part of the core Perl language itself. We don't know yet. So we're aware that there's some discussion there, but we're not there yet. We're keeping it clean. We're keeping it simple. We're actually going to have real methods and not just subroutines that have an invocant or whatever. So you can distinguish. So if you export a sum function into your class, and then you have a sum method, and you call the sum method, Perl will know to call the method and not the function. So that's nice and clean. Finally, we're decoupling data accessors, object construction. We're separating all of that out to make it easier to manage that. But we don't yet know what the MVP is going to look like or how extensible we can make it. So we've got some work to do, but we're getting so much closer. And we just need to convince P5P and the steering committee that this is the way to go. But I think we're on a good start. So thank you very much for taking the time to attend my talk. Again, Ovid at allaroundtheworld.fr. Please email me if you're interested in hearing more, or join us online in the various online forums that we have. I'm easy to find. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Bye-bye.